Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, sponsored by the HIBAR Research Alliance, also known as the HRA. I'm Scott Slovic from the University of Idaho, and I'll be the moderator of today's one-hour event. This is the second in what we hope will be an extensive series of useful and engaging webinars for researchers, research administrators, and others who are interested in what we call highly integrative, basic, and responsive research. As most of you who are attending this webinar probably realize, the HIBAR Research Alliance, also known as the HRA, has a website that describes the activities of the organization's 4 collaborative action groups, or CAGs. CAG number 2 is working to encourage the creation of new HIBAR research projects, and it is with this goal in mind that we've started this webinar series comprised of presentations by experienced HIBAR researchers and administrators. The first webinar took place on June 10th of this year, and the recording is now available for viewing on the HRA website. Before we start with today's presentation by Dr. Philip Evans, I wanted to explain the structure of this meeting. We will begin with a brief introduction to HIBAR. Next, our featured presenter, Dr. Evans, will give us an overview of the HIBAR aspects of his research for approximately 20 minutes. Then have 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A, followed by a brief opportunity for Dr. Evans to offer any final takeaways. Now I believe we're ready to get started. So I'd first like to invite Dr. Lauren Whitehead, Professor of Applied Physics and Special Advisor on Innovation, Entrepreneurship, and Research at the University of British Columbia, to offer an introduction to the concept of HIBAR and to the HIBAR Research Alliance. Dr. Whitehead?
Thanks very much. I'm just going to try to open this presentation here. Well, thanks very much, Scott. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm going to be relatively brief, but we have been told that there are a number of people on the call today that are relatively new to the HIBAR Research Alliance. So just a few words about what HIBAR Research is, what the Alliance is, and a bit of an introduction to Phil Evans as well. So we describe HIBAR research as enhancing fundamental research excellence in service to society. And the we, in part, consists of the 11 universities that you see on the screen here. But very importantly, the HIBAR Research Alliance is open to participation by all. And not just people at universities, but very importantly, people in organizations that work with universities. So we do really encourage you to go to our website, and if you're interested in becoming involved, we'd love to hear from you. Well, here's a question. Why do we believe that we need more HIBAR research? Well, the reason is essentially this. Basic research is often quite disconnected from society. It's important but disconnected, but applied research is often forced to be kind of short-term focused. So both of those things are fine, but it's better if you want to have breakthroughs, if you can somehow avoid that problem. And that's what HIBAR does. This time-honored form of research, been around for a very long time, is called highly integrative, basic and responsive research because it combines important aspects of basic and applied research at the same time. That is, it integrates basic and applied research, and it does so, and this is very important, in key ways that makes the research better. It makes the research more likely to be both innovative and impactful. So without going into too much detail, I'll just describe what we mean about these 4 ideas for integration. Basically, they relate to the why, the how, the who, and the when of research projects. So if a research project has an intent to discover new knowledge, and it also has a desire to solve societal problems, and so both answers to why are there, then that could make it a HIBAR project. But that alone is not enough. That's just a requirement. Another very important requirement is the how the work takes place. So the questions here are, is it scholarly work? Is it taking place with a scholarly rationale and procedure? But also, in addition, is it guided by modern use-inspired creative processes that look quite different than some aspects of academic work? If the answer is yes in both cases, then it could be HIBAR. But there's another requirement, very importantly, the people involved. And so the questions there are, do we have, or does the project have established basic researchers deeply engaged in the project, and also societal experts who are true partners in the leadership of the project from the beginning. Very often that latter point is missing, and it's incredibly important. Studies have shown it matters a great deal that we have expertise of all these types involved in a project. And then finally, there's a time frame aspect, which is that HIBAR projects are long-term. And so it's necessary to have everyone involved, the external experts and the university experts, in for the long haul, yet also maintaining urgency. And that maintaining urgency is critical. So if the answer to all 8 of these questions is yes, that's a HIBAR project. And that's why HIBAR projects are actually relatively rare. They're important. We need to have more of them. And so that's why the mission of the HIBAR Research Alliance is as follows. It is to achieve within 10 years a system-wide 4-fold increase in the fraction of research projects that are HIBAR. Specifically, that means going from roughly 1 project in 20 in universities today that are HIBAR to about 1 in 5. And very importantly, while also strengthening all other important forms of research. There's nobody losing here, but we believe through proper organization and incentivization, it'll be possible to actually greatly increase the amount of HIBAR research that does take place. Now, I'd like to illustrate that, and it looks like a complicated diagram, but its intent is simply to say universities are big, wonderful places with many kinds of research. And we can describe them in various ways, and I'd like to describe them here as consisting of certain subsets, and I'd like to refer to Dr. Evans' upcoming presentation when I do that. So in this multifaceted, complex world of research, there's a subset of research that's really aimed at discovering new knowledge. Dr. Evans will be talking about a project where he and his colleagues are discovering fundamental ways, new ways, to differentiate tree species. Just basic understanding about nature. Another way you can look at projects is to ask, do they solve societal problems? And here I've shown a different box. This box is sort of outlining research projects that have that character. And there's a huge problem that Dr. Evans is addressing, and that's loss of endangered tree species due to illegal harvesting. So he's in that box as well. The next one is long-term, where there's a need to have projects that can go for enhanced periods of time because they're that difficult. And certainly the challenge that Dr. Evans is addressing has that characteristic of being long-term. And then lastly, there's the involvement of partners in society. And again, in this case, this is both a scientific problem, a political problem, and it's a law enforcement problem. And if Dr. Evans wasn't deeply involved with the societal experts in those aspects of the problem, it would be very difficult to participate, to maintain the success that he is having. So now, just before I hand over to Dr. Evans, I'd like to paint a picture for that goal of HIBAR that I described. HIBAR research lies at the intersection of those 4 sets I just described. So right in the center there is highly integrative, basic, and responsive research that has all of those characteristics that we've described and which Dr. Evans will be sharing with you. So here's the graphic picture. This is a picture of the university system today where the stars represent very good research all over the place through all aspects of all the perturbations and combinations we've described. But importantly, in that central box, the HIBAR research box, you see about 1/20th of these projects are there. So that we believe, through experts that have studied this and discussed it at length, is roughly the fraction of today's research that ticks all those boxes I showed you a few moments ago. So here's the transition that we are picturing. It's just a moderate shift to the overall research of the university system that has this dramatic effect of quadrupling the number of projects that are in that sweet zone in the center. And that zone matters historically because that's where more breakthroughs happen, many more breakthroughs. And for that reason, I'll show those as larger stars. So this, I hope, this gives you a picture of what we're intending to do. And Dr. Evans, to help illustrate that, I'd like to just say a couple more words and then hand over to you. First of all, we're operating in a way that involves, is open to all for membership in 4 different collaborative action groups. I won't read them out, but they're all listed here and they're on our website. And we find that people that become involved often find one of these groups to be very interesting for them. And we very much welcome you come and join. And as Scott mentioned a moment ago, one of these groups is, of course, responsible for creating this webinar series that is now underway. So to summarize, we would very much welcome your support. Here is the website that you can go to, and thank you very much for being here today. So on that note, I'd like to wrap up and hand over to Dr. Slovic and Dr. Evans.
Thanks very much, Lauren. And now it's my pleasure to hand the podium over to Dr. Evans to tell us about his work.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott. I'll just share this screen with everyone. Hi, my name's Phil Evans and I'm the BC Leadership Chair at the University of British Columbia, and I want to describe this multi-partner research project on forensic detection of illegally logged timber. So wood may seem a strange material to be studying at a university because it conjures up images of old men like me in garages making things in their spare time. And as academics, we know we don't have much spare time. But you'd be surprised how things have moved on in the world of wood. And there's some very exciting developments in the uses of wood that you may not be aware of, apart from what I'm going to talk about today. You know, the about 10 to 15% of the wind turbine blades that are used to generate renewable energy are actually made of a balsa wood core material, because it's super lightweight and very strong, and also it's renewable, and so less carbon is used to generate the renewable energy. Very large timber buildings are going up around the world, again driven by the need to use sustainable materials. And for a while at UBC we had the largest wooden building in the world on campus. I think it's been overtaken now, and these are called ply scrapers. Obviously wood has great value in many areas, not least of which are wooden musical instruments. And one very interesting use of wood in the 1950s and 60s was that wood was used as a heat shield on some of the early Russian and Chinese re-entry vehicles. So wood is a lot more than you think it is. About this HIBAR project, I've structured it in a way so you can see the connections between the elements of the research project and the 4 criteria for a HIBAR project. And I'll go through each one of these. So I won't spend a lot of time right now on this particular slide. So let's look first at the basic research aspect and the applied aspect. A little bit about, before we get to basic and applied research, the forensics and the background to this project. Forensics is simply the application of scientific methods to investigate a crime. In this case, it's illegal logging. And the law that needs to be enforced refers back to an international agreement between government that restricts trade in endangered species. That can include rhino horns, elephant tusks, various animal parts, and also wood derived from tree species that are threatened with extinction. Well, the crime of illegal logging is extremely lucrative because a rosewood cabinet, as you can see on the top right-hand side of that slide, is valued at $28,000. And on below that, you can see the seizure of rosewood in Asia. The value of illegal logging, the crime of illegal logging, is something close to $50 to $150 billion annually. That's an estimate by Interpol. And furthermore, it's a crime that virtually goes undetected because trees are felled, some of which are listed by CITES as endangered and prohibited from trade, and they're mixed up with wood that can be traded legally. These logs or wooden boards are then typically sent overseas to countries which do a lot of manufacturing, and then they're then converted into products. After they get converted into logs or boards or products, it's virtually impossible to tell whether a piece of wood belongs to the class of timbers that can't be traded versus those that can be traded. So the crime of illegal logging is virtually undetectable. It's a lot easier to detect the a crime of trading in ivory or rhino horns, but very difficult to detect illegally logged timber. The aim of this project is to develop the knowledge and specifically the tools to detect illegally logged timber. And we need to integrate basic and applied research to do this. So the basic research, and something I've been engaged in for 35 years, is to look at wood structure and the chemistry of wood and the numerous metabolic products that are stored at the center of trees called heartwood. Differences in structure and wood chemical composition can be used to identify different wood species. So that's the basic research. The applied research is to use this knowledge and the tools we're developing to separate timbers that are listed by CITES that can't be traded and separate them from timbers that look very similar. So I'm just going to give you an example of where we got started with this project. And on the right-hand side, you can see a list of wood species that belong to the family Oricariaceae. That contains over 40 wood species from 40 different trees. Only one of those species is listed by CITES and cannot be traded, and that's a tree called the monkey puzzle tree, and you've probably seen those around the place. So all of the woods from all the other trees can be traded, but this one can't be because it's endangered and threatened with extinction. So traditionally, we try to separate wood using differences in structure. So we take a piece of wood, we cut a microscope slide, we look at its structural features, and in this particular case, the slide at the bottom right-hand side, I could tell immediately that that is a member of the family Oricariaceae. But it's impossible to tell which species it belongs to within that family. So the first work we did in this whole arena was to look at whether we could separate out the CITES listed species Oricaria oricana, the monkey puzzle tree, from others, particularly South American piranha pine, Oricaria angustifolia, and then some species that are grown in Australia and New Zealand. So that's where we started. We used traditional approach and a rather new approach, which we think is quite creative. The traditional approach was to simply collect authentic wood samples of all those 5 species I mentioned from around the world, from organizations that have wood museums. These are collections like a library of different wood species, and they may hold as many as 100,000 samples of wood representing tens, even larger numbers of woods. These are a key to this work. We looked at the wood structure, and we weren't surprised that we couldn't tell the difference between the various members of the Oricariaceae. But what we did employ, which is the creative aspect of this approach, is a new technique involving mass spectrometry and machine learning to identify the different wood species. So we're using this to see if we can go beyond the family level to identify different wood species. And because this technique has to be deployed in law enforcement, it has to be quick and very cost effective. So we take little splinters of wood, and I'll just show you a video of what we do. And this goes into a stream of ionized helium. Fragments of wood come off, molecular fragments come off in the form of a mass spectrum. And then we use machine learning technology to separate out the whole suite of fragments that come off the different wood species. And what we were able to show using an unsupervised machine learning program was that, yes, indeed, we could separate out the CITES listed species monkey puzzle, which is in blue, from its red South American sister species, and then also separate out monkey puzzle tree from some of the Australian species. So it looked very promising, and this particular work has been used to detect, after the fact, samples of wood that did enter North America and have now been proved to have been illegally logged timbers. Very recently, in the last 2 months, we're adopting technology taken from the oil forensics fields to identify which oil wells that oil comes from that's spilt in Vancouver Harbour. And we're applying this to illegally logged rosewoods. And we've been able to show that this particular technique, again, a spectrometry technique, can separate out very closely related rosewood species that make up about 40% of all of the illegally logged timber traded in the world. So that's some of the basic and applied research that we're doing. Who are the partners? There are lots of partners in this project. There are the universities and museums around the world that hold the authentic samples of the timbers that we need to look at. We need to look at multiple samples of authenticated wood species. And we're extremely lucky that these wood museums still exist. And so a couple of the partners are Kew, Royal Botanical Gardens, their Wood Lab, Jodrell Laboratory, the US Timber Lab in Madison, University of Toronto, University of Laval, obviously UBC, we're a partner on this particular side. And then on the forensic side, the partners are the US Fish and Wildlife Service Wildlife Crime Lab in Ashland, Oregon, and then the Environment Canada laboratory in North Vancouver. So those are the partners. On the academic side, I can't stress enough the role that we play really in repositories of academic knowledge on wood structure and taxonomy. Wood structure and wood anatomy has been a dead field for as long as I can remember. There are only a handful of people that can identify wood using traditional techniques. And the wood libraries that hold these vital reference materials have been neglected for decades. In fact, most of my colleagues in our faculty don't even know we have a wood collection. We've reached out to all of the partner organizations to try and get them to catalog their collections, because without these collections, we can't move forward on the forensic side. And then the law enforcement agencies, as I mentioned, there's the US Fish and Wildlife Lab. The US has the only wildlife crime lab in the world at Ashland, Oregon. And they're way ahead of the rest of the world in this area. Quite lately, Canada's become involved, and this has only happened in the last year, and so we've been working with them as well. Okay, so long-term goals and urgency. Our long-term goal on the academic side is to conserve those vital wood collections, to integrate the databases across multiple partners, develop protocols for sharing samples between academia and law enforcement agencies. We'd ideally like to develop less destructive methods of sampling wooden objects because, for example, electric guitars made of mahogany, which is a CITES listed species, you need to take very small samples from electric guitars because musicians don't like you cutting big holes in them. So that's a need. We'd love to have non-expert systems for initial screening of samples to tell whether a species is actually belonging to the basket of illegally logged timbers. And we need to select and optimize the chemical and data-driven approaches for identifying wood. Well, really, all of these points are urgent, but the urgency in the project is coming from law enforcement and the fact that if we don't really get a grip on this, illegal logging will continue unabated, leading to destruction of forest ecosystems, loss of tax revenue to governments, Illegal logging is a method by which criminals launder other money that they get from, for example, narcotics, people smuggling, etc. So it's really urgent that we get action on particularly the conservation of the wood collections and the selection and optimization of the approach that we're using now. So to summarize, really, what have we achieved and what's our impact been? Well, we've got a number of promising new approaches to wood species identification based on chemistry rather than structure. We have developed a consortium of university academics who, in Canada anyway, who curate the xylaria, the wood collections that are essential to the project outcomes. We've established linkages between academia, museums in the case of Kew, and the government labs. And of course, we've been publishing our work, but that hasn't been a main goal, for me at least. I know that our work on the monkey puzzle tree has shown that past shipments of wood from the US into the US from South America contained illegally logged timber. We weren't able to prove that in the past. And this has given customs greater confidence to seize timber, knowing that we can come up with answers. And I believe that, particularly in the US, some of the cases are going to trial, although the methods in Canada right now are not advanced enough for that to happen. What's been the big surprise? Well, the project is so important, I think, to conserve the world's forests and the animals and people that live in them, that a lot of people have freely donated their time to the project, which is just as well because we don't have any funding. A great surprise to me has been some of the objections that I've received to the project from people that import timber from developing countries, and even from some funding agencies that rely on levies from the timber industry. And so the politics of the area is starting to impact the work, but thankfully not in Canada or the US. But it certainly would be difficult to do this kind of project in other countries. The politics can also impinge on government laboratory priorities. So if Canada elects a more right-leaning government, there will be a greater focus on oil spill forensics rather than timber forensics. We'll wait and see what happens in Canada in terms of the election. And I guess overall support for a robust program in some countries, as I mentioned, would be difficult. The challenges of a HIBAR project, and I don't think this is new to people involved in HIBAR. We've had good progress, and the people have been finding a way to overcome various issues. You know, the very poor state of all the reference collections. People are donating time, transferring money from other grants to try and get movement on this. You know, communication, we're trying to improve that. The institutional priorities of academia are obviously focus on publications, grants, those types of things. The priorities from the government labs are quite different, but we've been able to come together on those. Where do we need additional expertise, maybe leading to a new project? I really think there's a great project here in using machine vision technologies, cell phones, and AI programs to screen wood in developing countries to tell whether we're in the right ballpark as far as dealing with an illegally logged timber. We need partners, more partners with access to comprehensive wood collections. And finally, of course, we need some funding because we're not funded at the moment, or at least on the academic side. The government, of course, is supporting their labs. So that's where I think I'll finish up. Hope I'm onto time, Scott, and welcome any discussion and questions.
Thank you very much, Phil. That was excellent. Very, very interesting. It raised a lot of important points, not only specific to your research, but to HIBAR more generally. I wonder if I could begin the discussion by using a few of the questions that I had prepared ahead of time. You mentioned traditional approaches to wood identification versus some of the new high-tech approaches. I wonder if you've encountered, or if you anticipate that you'll encounter in the future, any conflict between traditional research methods and the creative new methods that you were describing. And if so, how would you manage the tension within the field of wood identification and wood science that might arise later?
That's a great question, Scott. Of course, this tension has arisen because the academic field of wood structure and identification has been dead for 50 years. And there's very few of us around that can identify wood using traditional microscopy. So there are too few experts around. Now, I could train people to competently identify a subsection of wood, perhaps the CITES listed species, but that kind of training has not been going on. So we have moved to these more advanced techniques. The problem with that is that the machines that we're using are very expensive. A Dart Top S machine is $500,000, and it needs a lot of maintenance contracts. So the big question for me is whether these techniques are appropriate for frontline detection and use in some developing countries where we need a big effort. And so I think at the back of my mind, anyone can cut a section of wood. The problem is interpreting the structural information that's there, and that's where an expert system comes in. But I believe there's the potential to use, now I wouldn't call it artificial intelligence, but rule-based machine learning to, I guess, screen through the structural information and come up with potential matches. I think this approach might be more appropriate for developing countries, and this is why I put forward this project to try and catalyze some information in that area.
Thank you. Phil, I wonder if I could ask you a question or two related to your partners. I'm curious to know the role of your partners, especially the non-academic partners, in helping to raise fundamental research questions that you've been pursuing. Have they played that role, or has it mostly been on the academic side that you've tried to come up with the questions related to basic research?
No, I think that they've been quite heavily involved in raising questions. It's really been, I wouldn't say they've been raising questions separately. It's really been a joint raising of issues. And some very interesting questions are coming up about their chemical and analytical techniques are throwing up issues about whether two species are more closely related to each other than two other species, and the whole point about what is a species. And we've been able to find some samples in the wood collections which appear to be hybrids. And so that's where the applied aspect of the project is sort of running over into sort of more fundamental questions about species and hybridization, which is relevant to law enforcement because you can't tell if one of the species was CITES listed and the other one was not CITES listed, if there was a hybrid there. CITES doesn't actually say anything about hybrids. It lists species. So there's been some really interesting things come up on the applied side, which are leading us onto other, I guess, more fundamental academic issues. So I'd say it's not them versus us, it's more joint things are happening and we're discussing them, but their focus has to remain on getting a technique that they can use to identify wood that's coming into Canada or the US.
Phil, it's also evident that you're working with a variety of academic partners coming from different disciplinary perspectives. And I'd be curious to know whether there are any particular challenges you found in bringing together academic disciplines that don't traditionally work together, such as criminal justice colleagues in certain types of chemistry and physics and in forestry?
Yeah, personally, it hasn't been a problem for me because I have some background in most of those areas, having had a long career and run a Centre for the Science and Engineering of Materials at the Australian National University. So I'm familiar with many of those areas. But I would say for the people in law enforcement, they certainly struggle to get to grips with the wood structure and the taxonomy because they are organic chemists. I can't speak for my other academic colleagues, although some of the traditional wood structure people just wouldn't venture into the chemistry area. So personally, I haven't found it too much of an issue, but I can understand how difficult it would be for somebody who is just a botanist to comprehend what we're doing on the chemistry side.
Mm-hmm. Also related to your academic partners, I'm curious to know what role students and untenured colleagues play in the project and whether they face any particular challenges, perhaps even challenges related to promotion and tenure, and what their approaches have been or may be in the future to overcoming these challenges. For instance, if your project results in criminal convictions, how might these figure into a tenure case in the future?
Well, that's a very interesting point. You have to remember that in the last HIBAR project, we were dealing with I guess a non-tenured academic beginning her career, and I'm completely the opposite. I have a personal endowed chair, and I'm 4 years or maybe longer from retirement, and I pretty much am free to choose what I do, and the pressures to publish, to get research money are not there at all in my case. And I do have the luxury of some funding from an endowment to put into this project. So I really don't think that this would be a project for someone starting out. It's just too big, it's too complicated, and I have worked as a forensic expert over the years for the Australian Federal Police, the Bureau of Air Safety Investigation, all sorts of organisations. I have a background in forensics as well. It would not be possible for someone starting out to manage this project. But on the other hand, the students are fascinated by this area, and I've taken on a student who's actually a musician who makes electric guitars. And he's seeing whether the musical performance of electric guitars made from plantation-grown mahogany match those of mahogany from natural forests. So we've been able to pull in students into the projects, and he's doing work in the government labs, as well as obviously in my lab. My academic colleagues in University of Laval, the University of Toronto, and Natural Resources Canada, they're all towards my end of the spectrum. They're all tenured profs. I'm glad that Lorne mentioned the need to go beyond 5 years, because in 5 years' time, I'll be on a farm in Australia growing trees and organic food, and there is a need for the faculty to replace me. And I think this project will help, because we will show real impacts through this project, as well as some nice publications. And I think that will convince the dean that maybe he should get a replacement for me.
One area of concern, though, is the apparent challenge in finding funding for this kind of work. You're lucky to be in the position you're in because you can carve out a bit of your general funding for this work. What would you recommend to junior colleagues in the field? I know you're saying you actually would be cautious in bringing up-and-coming academics into this area of research because of the scarcity of funding. And yet this seems like an extremely important area for future work because of the threats to forests and to entire ecosystems and species that live in those systems.
I think it would, you see, the project is, the need for this the tools are so urgent in my mind that I'm foregoing, I guess, opportunities to write grants and just simply going ahead with it. Because it would be 18 months before I could even start the project. And that's the time frame that we'd be looking at to really get funding for the project. And the law enforcement people, they're phoning me every day. I can't wait 18 months. So I mean, that's why I feel that the project isn't really one for untenured faculty. But yeah, there would be aspects to the project that, particularly getting in-kind contributions from the law enforcement agencies, which could allow a young academic to enter the area. It's also not an easy area either. So, the demands on numbers of publications are so high now. I question whether it could be done actually. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah, although I guess the question is whether whatever funding is available from law enforcement is merely funding your work on specific samples that they're sending you or that you happen to have, or whether they're able to provide enough funding to actually support additional research.
Yeah, well, they are. As I mentioned, I have a graduate student working on electric guitars who's spending a lot of time in the government labs. So they're putting in significant in-kind support to a project that's only peripherally related to this particular one.
So I'm wondering if it might make sense for us to turn to any final overarching suggestions that you might have based on this work. That would be helpful to researchers and administrators interested in HIBAR more broadly, or in perhaps other disciplines dealing with other kinds of problems. So perhaps at this point we could turn toward final takeaways that you might wish to offer.
Okay, I guess the most important element of the project is really communication between the disciplines. Being able to establish links between different academics, different expertise, and then the people in law enforcement who are working on the chemistry side, and also understanding how our culture in academia differs from theirs. So I think that was something that Kathy raised after the last HIBAR seminar, the need to put in time to establish the links. So, for example, I went to London 2 weeks ago to establish the link with Q, and got on very well with their wood anatomist, who seemed very pleased that there was someone else in the world who was interested in wood anatomy. And he's offered now to come over and give a course for free as long as we pay his airfare. So I think spending time on relationship building is a key with these projects that's basic and applied research. I guess from my point of view, nearing the end of my career, and I think there are lots of academics who are tenured profs, I think a willingness to perhaps go outside of the academic paradigm and perhaps do a project that's going to have an impact rather than outputs. I'm not a prolific publisher, but I have a couple of hundred publications. I feel that this project is nice. It's not going to lead to large numbers of publications, but it's going to have an impact. And it's also quite inspiring to our students. So I think the willingness of tenured professors to step outside of the model and then do something a bit different, even if there's a risk that there won't be those outputs, but there will be impacts, and I think that's important. I guess the final message, well, there's two final messages really, is that the funding issue, the external funding that could be brought in, it takes too long to get hold of it. These forests are being logged around the world, in the Amazon, in Asia, at a really rapid rate. Within the 18 months it would take me to write and obtain let's say, a large grant, huge swathes of forest are going to be cut down. Sometimes you just have to act yourself and use your own time and those of others to attack a problem. So in that sense, I think some of the funding, even small amounts of funding would help. But this, I found with this project, people are willing to put in their own time and even bits of their own money because it's such an important problem. So my final point is that there are lots of opportunities to develop new projects out of this one. And the one area in which I'm not familiar with and I guess not as comfortable in is the whole area of machine vision. I mean, we've had a project using machine learning to redesign cricket bats. I've just lost the engineer that did that work, but it would be nice to develop a very simple, low-stroke, high-tech technique to identify wood on the ground using machine vision and machine learning technologies. So I think out of these HIBAR projects, you get new projects, but they're never dull. They're always exciting. And this is the project that's keeping me in academia right now. So I'm very happy about it.
Phil, this last point that you made about developing new techniques for identifying wood, I wonder if this might be applicable to what you were discussing before we actually began the formal webinar regarding the application of this work to issues arising in developing countries where they may not have access to the machinery that you have in your lab in Vancouver.
Yeah, absolutely. If we could develop a cell phone-based app that could tell whether we're dealing with a rosewood or a closely related species, then that would be extremely useful because someone just on the ground could then scan timber that's coming in at a port, and that could then be diverted to customs, who could send samples to a central facility or even send them here. We only need a splinter of wood to do the analytical work. So I think that's the thing that's missing, and I think that can be done right now, but we need, again, the right linkages to be created.
Yeah, good. Well, I think this idea of looking for the right linkages in order to foster additional creativity it's intrinsic to the basic idea of HIBAR, establishing these relationships and using imagination to pursue fundamental questions and societal applications is really what HIBAR is all about. This has been a very enlightening and exciting presentation, and I greatly appreciate your offering this to us.
Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for listening in. I hope you've got an understanding of this area and I guess how important it is to get solutions to this problem.
Well, with that, thank you very much. And I think we can end our meeting at this time. So thanks very much.
Thank you.